Hi, everybody. I'm Sandy Childs with APR, the Association of Plastic Recyclers. And I am very pleased to be presenting some information about plastic packaging sustainability to the Pet Sustainability Coalition. And I thank Melissa for the invite. I thought I'd get started by showing you a picture of my puppy. Since this is where we are, this is what she thinks of noodles. Just not fond of noodles. Like, what are you giving me this stuff for? Anyway, we'll get started on the presentation. So who is APR? We are the only North American organization focused exclusively on plastics recycling, because there's no way that plastic packaging could be sustainable without recycling. There's a lot that goes into plastic packaging sustainability, and recycling is extremely important. Our membership comprises about 95% of the plastics packaging recycling capacity in North America. So we know plastics recycling in and out. Our primary goals are all revolving around improving the industry, making our voice stronger, particularly in public policy debates, which I'll talk about today. And we do a range of things with that in mind. We try to be the bridge between package design and recycling infrastructure by providing design guidance, test methods for companies to verify recyclability. We do training for corporate entities. We have a communication and advocacy program where we make sure that the plastics recyclers have a platform. We try to reward companies that participate, that purchase recycled content materials. And we also work individually with companies on consulting our member companies about how to make their packages more recyclable. We have a large interface with just about every industry group out there, and I noticed that many of these groups are speaking at this conference as well. So here's a snapshot of plastics recycling today. Easy to understand, right? There is just a tremendous amount going on, and part of our job is to try to make it more clear. So what do we know? We know that plastics is taking a huge reputational hit due to the realities of environmental pollution. And then because of this, brands are under a lot of pressure to make their packaging more sustainable. And since plastic is a very efficient material, sustainable plastic materials are a big focus. So between these private brand commitments and the legislation that I'm going to briefly talk about, there's a huge demand for post-consumer recycled plastic that's been created. But at the same time, the recycling rates for many plastics are pretty stagnant, and they have been for a long time. So at the nexus of all of this are potential public policy solutions. And we're seeing a lot of that now after not seeing it for many years. But are they sensible? And is it going to solve the problem? So to introduce this slide, I want to just say I'm not a public policy expert. That's not my strength. I am more of a program manager, technical writer. It's an area that is obviously interesting, but it's a little too messy for me to participate in. But to at least introduce the topic, therefore, I'm going to step back. I'm not going to say, oh, this is great, or oh, this is horrible. Let's just look at why we would want public policy. And I think the goals of good public policy we could all agree on would be to solve real problems that exist using methods based on consensus and data. Unfortunately, sometimes that doesn't really translate into the real world. And you have public policy and legislators who have good intentions, but they end up picking winners and losers. They're focused on imposing punishment. These companies were bad actors, and so we have to make them pay. Not using data is a big problem. There is good reason to listen to constituents, but data is available and very important. enriching the state. The first goal of public policy should not be to just raise some money for the general fund. And what we're also seeing, and this is not a new problem, is states are very protective of their own territory, understandably. But in today's global marketplace, it's a little unrealistic to expect, for example, that every pound of plastic collected in a state should be also processed and remanufactured within that state. It's good intention, but not really well thought out. So starting here, let's look at some policy proposals for plastics. So there's three general types that you might look at. Extended producer responsibility, called EPR, recycled content mandates, and then bottle deposit and return system, also called bottle bills. I'm going to talk a little about the first two. The third one is more focused on the beverage industry and rigid containers, so maybe not necessarily as appropriate for this audience. So we'll talk about the first two. So extended producer responsibility, an interesting concept, and we have it now in Oregon and Maine. So here's a little background. This EPR is very popular and widespread in Europe, and there are three main positive features to extended producer responsibility. The original manufacturer or supplier of a package in the consumer marketplace is required to take on some of the responsibility for the recycling of that product or package. And it happens in two ways: a de facto way where they say, well, you make thousands and thousands of packages, and so for every single one, we're gonna assign a little fee. And then the second part is interesting, eco-modulation, where the fees can be reduced or increased depending on the impact of the package on the system. Is it designed well to be 100% recyclable? Then maybe your fees are less. If it has a known undesirable impact on the system, the fee would be more. And then the fees provide the system funding. Stakeholder organizations, called producer responsibility organizations, or other terms, are convened to measure progress, set new priorities, be accountable for the results, and also manage the money. So instead of the money just going to the state, it goes to a stakeholder organization where you would hope everybody would be represented who has information, first of all, and an interest in the system. So Oregon has a very interesting new EPR law along these lines. And this information came from another presentation that was done by another APR staffer, along with David Alloway, who's an incredibly smart individual with the Oregon DEQ. So there's a snapshot of how it'll work up in the corner, but essentially the PROs in the state will be both operationally and financially responsible for the collection and recycling of a specific list of materials. The PRO will set the fees, and the members will pay the fees on covered products sold in the state. And then the eco-modulation is given consideration to the post-consumer content, product to package ratio, material choice, life cycle impact, and recycling rate. So Oregon's kind of an interesting state. It's way up in the northwest of the country. It's not highly populated. It's not very wealthy, but they have a wealth of natural resources in Oregon. They are the state that passed the first deposit law for beverage containers, I think. This is also one of those well thought out bills, and we're hoping that it works as intended. The funding formula changes are interesting that the law makes, because currently the commodity sales of recyclable materials only pay 15% of the entire recycling system costs, leaving the ratepayers to pay the rest. The new system assigns 28% of those costs to the actual package producers, and I'm not sure how the 28% was derived, but again, there's a lot of information about this on the web, and the SPC actually did a pretty good analysis of this one. So the ratepayers will continue to fund the collection costs, which is the direct service to them. The producers will fund the marketing and sortation costs after revenues because those are the costs they're indirectly responsible for. So it's an interesting law, and Oregon's bottle bill, in my humble opinion, is actually the best one in the country. So I'm hoping that this also becomes a good model for other states to follow. So now let's go to Maine, which is also up in the middle of nowhere in the far eastern part of the country, also lightly populated with a wealth of natural resources. And they have a different approach to EPR in Maine, where there'll be only one product stewardship organization under contract with the state to operate that stewardship program. And all producers are required to join that PSO. It's going to be responsible for the financial costs of the program, so it will pass the money through from packaging producers to the local governments to reimburse them for the costs of managing the recycling systems. And this is going to be interesting because that's the way Canadian EPR started many years ago. And I think in Canada, there's been an ongoing dialogue about how fair that is. You know, if the producers have no say in what materials are collected or how they're processed and marketed, is it really fair to have them pay all the costs for something they don't have any control over at all? So it's an interesting way of doing things. And again, this law also adds the eco-modulation to encourage movement toward more sustainable packaging. That was just a little tiny bit about EPR. Again, I'm not the expert, but hopefully that will give you enough information to find more detail about it. Recycled content is another area where there's a lot of interest. And as I said in the beginning, plastics recycling is not sustainable without recycling. Well, the recycled plastic created in the system has to go somewhere. And putting it back into new plastic packaging products is a whole topic we could talk about for hours. There are food contact regulations, there are quality issues, there's volume issues, and there are many converters that manufacture packaging who are already working very closely with recyclers to ensure that that partnership works well. I don't know at this point how pertinent this is to the pet food and pet products industry, because I understand much of the packaging in the industry is not rigid plastic containers, but flexible plastic containers, and that there are more challenges to that, and you can get in touch with me and we'll talk about that more. But this is where we're seeing recycled content legislation, California and Washington. Now, California, it's a great state. It's very beautiful. They really have a lot of recycling legislation, and I don't pretend to understand how any of this is going to work, and it's new, but there are some strict requirements for average recycled content, specifically in beverage containers that are subject to their deposit system, which is called CRV. So it's mostly here for rigid containers, a lot of beverage containers, which is one thing that California is really good at. They've had this CRV law in place for many, many years. There have been a lot of adjustments to it. So this would seem to be fairly well thought out. There, of course, is a provision to adjust the minimum post-consumer recycled content percentages. And there are some considerations that CalRecycle, which is the regulatory agency in California, some considerations that they can use to adjust those minimums, including recycling rate, infrastructure, how well the industry is doing in compliance. And then again on California, there's reporting requirements by pound and resin type, and they're just going through now a regulatory process where they're going to decide such things as closures and labels and, the ancillary part of a bottle. How does that count? So, again, this is mostly focused on containers covered by their CRV, but you can get an overview by following that website link. And then they also allow people to comment on the regulatory process. So that's going to be interesting. California is always very forward thinking on this. Whether they think it all through before they rush in, I don't, that we might be able to debate. Washington, again, out in that part of the country, has just passed their plastics recycled content law. And this one does include recycled content for trash bags, which is a really interesting concept, because when you think about it, everybody uses trash bags. They're black or colored material, so they can probably use some of the lower spec or lower quality recycled material. And they are, by definition, thrown away. So it really makes no sense at all to make them with 100% virgin plastic. And I know that several of the APR member companies, the recyclers who manufacture recycled plastic that goes into trash bags, had a role in developing and implementing and hopefully implementing this law. So I think it's the trash bag requirement might be a good lead in to recycled content requirements for other film packaging. But again, we'll have to see. There are a lot of technical issues involved in making a film out of recycled content plastics. So here are the thresholds for trash bags: 20% recycled content by 2027. So they're ramping up fairly carefully. And then they've also got household cleaning and personal care products in that law. The interesting thing about the Washington law, though, is that these requirements are not regulatory. They're not to be decided later. They are written into the legislation. So they're like immediate penalties for not complying because it's law. So it's a different approach, and it's kind of interesting because once it's signed into law, it's difficult to influence what happens. And APR is heavily involved in this. We are part of the advisory committee for implementation of this law. And it's going to be interesting to see how it works. Again, the law does provide some off-ramps, some things that can be considered, and there will be reporting on progress. So this one is going to proceed, and it'll be interesting to see how it works. So the Stakeholder Advisory Committee is also going to talk about recommendations for other types of plastic packaging. APR is a member, and again, they're very assertive about where they're going with this. So pending legislation, I don't want to talk too much about. I don't want to talk about the federal at all, but the New Jersey and New York recycled content requirements, I could not find whether or not this has been passed, which probably just shows you that I'm not a public policy expert. But again, it's another recycled content law, and this one does include plastic film reusable bags and plastic trash bags as targets for incorporating recycled content. And New York is kind of doing a bit of a hybrid extended producer responsibility law, which will have a big part of it being minimum content levels for plastic packaging. So again, this, I don't know if it's currently in committee. I don't know actually where it's at right now, but it's an interesting hybrid to follow for progress. So after providing that information, which I hope was useful, again, it was just an introduction into all of this. If there's arcane, impacts or bits of this legislation, I'm not the person to talk to about it. That would be Steve Alexander, our executive director. But I want to do just a quick little rundown about what the meaning is of all these recycled content levels. Now, this is for PET plastic bottles, the recycling rate since 2004. The yellow line hasn't really gone anywhere. In fact, it's been going down. I can tell you that I've been in this industry since, well, a lot longer than that. And I worked in the PET recycling industry for years, and this is reality. It's never gone up. The entire 30 plus years I've been in this business, the recycling rate has pretty much stayed the same. And then you have all these companies. Here's the list. And this is a report done by Circular Matters Consulting for Ameripen that just lays out who's made all these commitments for using recycled content. And it's a list of companies that we have all heard of. We all buy products from these big companies all the time, and they've made these commitments to use recycled content. So the question is, where is it going to come from? If we're stuck at a 30% recycling rate for PET, it looks like, if you look at this graph, the demand for all these different plastics based on these goals is shot up significantly. The current usage of recycled PET, for example, is only here. And if they were to have to be able to ramp up to maximum production capacity, this is pretty much all they could do right now. So there's a shortfall. If every state in the union passed a recycled content law that was like Washington's or New York's or anybody's for that matter, it would cause a really interesting supply problem, as you can see, because it's the same for HDPE. Now they could probably meet the targets with HDPE, but based on what's being used right now, it's not going to be easy. The LDPE, that's more the film plastic. And again, there's like nothing in terms of capacity. So this is a problem that I don't know what the solution is to it, but again, we're looking at the domestic reclamation capacity for PET having to more than double to meet these commitments. So I guess with that, I just like to offer some closing thoughts. Recycled content is good. I mean, we definitely want to reduce the use of virgin plastic. We need good markets for recycled plastic, and usually the highest value markets are back into the same type of product that it came from, although they're not the only sustainable markets. They're important. So the content requirements are here. They're likely to follow, and APR supports that. We think it's that providing encouraging markets for all the material that's collected is extremely important, and it's a public policy as well as a market-driven market out there. But again, on this, collection and supply side must be addressed if we're ever going to get near to meeting these goals. So we have to figure out ways to collect more plastics. And like I said before, I've been in this industry for over 30 years, and I have worked on numerous programs to increase supply of recycled materials. It's complicated. It's not only a technological problem. I mean, if there were little robots that would go into everybody's house and just pick up all their recyclables and take them to the curb and take them to the MRF, that'd be great. But somewhere in between the refrigerator and the curb, you've got a human being that has to understand and be motivated to participate. And then that's not even to think about all of the venues and events and commercial establishments and restaurants and campgrounds and this stuff is everywhere. It's not just in your typical single family household. So we all need to put our heads together and figure that out too. But if you expect that your company will be impacted by these types of legislation, this is a good time to join with APR or any of those other organizations I showed on the slide, and become a stakeholder in this legislative and rulemaking process and let your voice be known. What's good for your industry, what might not be so good right now for your industry, but you can work towards. So it's important time right now, and it's actually pretty exciting. I also want to encourage anybody who's interested to register for and attend the International Plastics Recycling Conference. First time in 2 years, we're going to host it in person. The APR member meeting will also be in conjunction with the conference in early March, and that will be held at the National Harbor Gaylord Hotel in Washington, D.C. So very exciting. I've looked at the program for that conference, and it's one of the best program agendas I've seen in years. So it's a great conference. And if you have any questions or comments, or you'd like to know what you can do to help or to participate, get in touch with me. There's also APR's website. We are on LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, anywhere else you can think of. And we have a podcast now called Recycled Content, which presents some of the cutting edge work that's going on right now in plastics recycling. So please join us. And again, thank you so much for allowing me to participate in your conference.